On Failure, Part 1. The Spartans, Oedipus Rex, Thucydides, and Socrates. The only thing we refuse to admit is that we are dependent upon powers that are beyond our control. Humanity's histories and literatures are consumed by our struggle with the concept of failure. Academically, we realize failure is a prerequisite for success, that it prepares us through struggle for supreme accomplishment. Yet, at the same time, we sharply criticize those who fail, celebrating when our enemies and even sometimes our friends fall short. Clearly, we have a paradoxical view of failure. This is especially true when failure is not a temporary setback from which we can hope to recover, but rather the conclusion of a noble but ultimately insufficient effort. We wonder why failure happens, especially to people who seem destined to succeed. We wonder if the blame for failure belongs solely to the individual, for their deficiency in skill or preparation, or if it belongs to society which did not prepare them to succeed, or if it created conditions that stretched beyond what it prepared them to handle. Ultimately, we fear that failure indicates a weakness in our personal character, that it is proof we're just not good enough. Whatever the cause, the sting of failure can last a lifetime. It may scar us to the point that we never again risk a meaningful challenge or responsibility for fear we'll suffer another humiliating defeat. How we view and cope with failure as a society says a great deal about how we interpret our place in the cosmos, specifically our relationship with our gods, religious or secular. If it feels like the cause for failure are powers beyond our control, specifically prophecy, we accept and even find honor in it. However, if the cause of failure is earthly, even if still outside our control, we relish the failure of others. The Spartans at Thermopylae. In 480 BC, a small band of Greek warriors, famously headed by 300 Spartans, made an impossible stand against an invading Persian force that outnumbered them by as many as 40 to 1. Most modern people know of the Battle of Thermopylae through Zack Snyder's fictionalized account in his 2006 movie 300, which beautifully celebrated the motif of noble failure through this battle. Thanks to rugged terrain, legendary training, and superior tactics, things initially went well for the Greeks. Well, that is, until a local farmer betrayed them, showing the Persians a shepherd's path that circled around the well-defended choke point, allowing them to flank the Greeks. Despite learning of this betrayal, the Greeks chose to remain and fight. Why the Spartans and their Greek allies refused to retreat from certain defeat can be found in a message King Leonidas of Sparta is said to have received after consulting the oracle at Delphi prior to the battle. The Pythia there said, "O ye men who dwell in the streets of broad Lacedaemon, either your glorious town shall be sacked by the children of Perseus, or in exchange must all through the whole Laconian country mourn for the loss of a king, descendant of great Heracles." Therefore, Leonidas believed defeat was certain in one form or another. Preordained by the gods, it was either him or Athens. There was no shepherd's path for Leonidas to discover around his destiny. But even if there was one, to avoid the fight at Thermopylae would have been both cowardly and blasphemous. A rejection of the gods' decree, regardless of how capricious it might have seemed to the Greeks. The only honorable thing for them to do was nobly fulfill their role in the pre-written tragedy. Therefore, Leonidas and the Greeks embraced the military failure, and history has embraced them as heroic archetypes. Oedipus Rex. Shortly after Thermopylae in 429 BC, Sophocles of Athens premiered his play Oedipus Tyrannus, or Oedipus the King. It tells the story of Oedipus, an honorable man whose life comes to ruin through little fault of his own. But rather than reacting with smug disdain for Oedipus because I would never make those horrendous mistakes, audiences then and since have understood that there are times when circumstances overwhelm us, no matter how strong or capable we are. And it's within these unforeseeable circumstances that we react in ways we cannot predict. In Oedipus's case, an oracle prophesied he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. And as we probably know, he did, in dramatic fashion. And then he stabs out his own eyes and begs to be exiled, as a chorus reminds the audience that no man should be considered fortunate until he is dead. We should note that the prophecy was punishment that had nothing to do with Oedipus's own behavior. He was incidental to it. It was a generational curse laid upon his father, King Laius of Thebes, for a drunken mistake. So though personally honorable and good, Oedipus was destined to fail, regardless of how he responded to the challenges he confronted. This predestined failure reflected the Greek view, as Homer made clear, that humanity is the plaything of fickle and capricious gods. So, to criticize Oedipus for his failure would have been to criticize the gods themselves, thereby inviting their wrath. We see in Oedipus the frightening principle that bad things very often happen to good people. This terrifying truth may render absurd the idea that one should live virtuously, since there appears to be no earthly or divine reward for it. Terrifying, since the divine dispensation of reward and punishment is cavalier and unpredictable, and as such entirely out of human hands, beyond human will to influence. Therefore, we're driven to claim that the tragedy of Oedipus is not his circumstances, which were out of his control, but rather how he chose to respond to his challenges, a view that later serves as the cornerstone of Stoicism. Therefore, we're desperate to find flaws in honorable people who fail. A flaw suggests they aren't as honorable as they appear. In doing so, we can explain their initial success as the product of some unknown sin, which gives us the luxury of believing our relative failure is due to a virtuous refusal to resort to the underhanded tactics that led to their initial success, but which ultimately caught up to them. But there's a sharper reason for searching out flaws in honorable individuals brought down by circumstances. It shakes us to understand that if uncommonly strong and capable people are vulnerable to circumstance, well, the rest of us are helpless insects caught in fate's web, doing what we can to struggle, but ultimately doomed. Locating a flaw in them, maybe the same one we ignore in ourselves, allows us to escape the conscious terror of what circumstances could do to us weaker, less capable souls. But this interpretation misses the exact point. Through theater, Sophocles reminds us that bad things often happen to good people, which therefore teaches us something important about failure. Namely, that failure is sometimes the inevitable product of events outside our control. And when that happens, failure says very little about us as individuals. In fact, our failures and how we handle them often speak positively to our character, suggesting failure can be honorable, even noble. The Peloponnesian War. Thucydides at Amphipolis. Shortly after Sophocles' Oedipus begged for exile from Thebes, the real-life Athenians exiled one of their real-life heroes. Like Oedipus, the famous general Thucydides enjoyed the love and praise of his countrymen following glorious early success. However, his fortunes changed at the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BC. There, the Spartans took control of the city when, it's said, Thucydides failed to arrive in time to reinforce the garrisoned Athenian general Eucles. The Battle of Amphipolis signaled a significant shift in the Peloponnesian War, which Athens ultimately lost. For centuries, Thucydides' reputation bore much of the responsibility for that loss. The Greek did not sympathize with him the way they did with Oedipus, although the underlying message was largely the same. Oedipus was faultless. His failure was inevitable, as it was divinely ordained. Thucydides was also faultless in the purest sense. Although he was blamed for not arriving at Amphipolis quickly enough, there's nothing he could have done to arrive quicker than he did. That seems well outside of dispute, even by his contemporaries. According to his Histories of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides made haste for Amphipolis the moment he received Eucles' plea for support. However, The city didn't know the messenger made it through the Spartan lines and that Thucydides was on his way. But the Spartan commander, Brasidas, did. He immediately sued for peace with the city leadership, convincing them that no help was on the way, but promising the people safety and the right to keep their possessions if they immediately surrendered. The city agreed. Thucydides arrived that very same day, but it was too late to save Amphipolis. The Spartans had already taken up impregnable defensive positions within the city. The circumstances of Thucydides' failure weren't divine. They were worldly. It was the wind that didn't push his sails along, or the wheels of his infantry that didn't spin faster. But it wasn't prophesied. It wasn't a divine decree. Therefore, Thucydides could be blamed without offending the gods. In fact, Thucydides served as the Athenian scapegoat for the gods, allowing them to vent their contempt for what the gods control, that is, fate, without blaming and therefore offending the gods directly. Of course, the Peloponnesian War didn't hinge on Amphipolis. Athens didn't fall from the loss of a single city. It fell from complacency. Once strong and pioneering, Athens was made soft by the comfort their ancestors' strength secured. Democracy, as Socrates pointed out, has a way of degenerating cultures unless it's vigilantly supported through education and social responsibility. By the time of the Peloponnesian War, Athenian democracy was a mechanism for diffusion of that responsibility. Their condemnation of Thucydides reflected that. Rather than accept responsibility for their defeat due to comfort-driven social degeneration, Athens outsourced the condemnation to Thucydides. Removing the god's influence from Thucydides' failure, the Greeks were able to find both him and Oedipus faultless, but not equally blameless. For Oedipus and Leonidas, things could not have turned out differently. The gods determined their paths, so they couldn't be blamed, for to blame Oedipus and Leonidas would have been to blame the gods and risk their wrath. Conversely, though hampered by worldly circumstances of wind and wheels, the gods didn't decide against Thucydides. Therefore, he could be blamed for failing to achieve the impossible, and he was, becoming Athens' scapegoat, scorned for his failure the way they might have scorned Oedipus or Leonidas if they could have done so without risking wrath from the gods. For Oedipus, exile from Thebes was mercy, but exiling Thucydides was Athens exercising mercy on itself. He had to be cast far from view and mind because, had he remained, he would have been a constant and damning reminder of their actual cultural failure, a living, breathing, walking among them reminder akin to Socrates, only quieter but still conscience-irking. If conscience would have allowed, it's easy to see how the Athenians might have executed Thucydides, hoping to symbolically kill something they hated in themselves. Again, akin to Socrates. Socrates. Speaking of, in 399 BC, a dumpy, aging Athenian man, a former soldier who fought in the Peloponnesian War, was brought to trial for the capital offenses of impiety and corrupting the youth. Though not guilty of the spirit of these charges, and despite being a prominent philosopher, Socrates was ultimately found guilty and executed. In his work, The Apology, Plato recounts his master's magnificent defense. According to Plato, the elder Socrates twisted up the younger, inexperienced prosecutor, the poet Meletus, exposing contradictions upon contradictions in the charges, and calling into question their very motivation. His defense was so powerful that Socrates was only convicted by a very narrow margin, having swayed many jurists who were initially prejudiced towards convicting him. Despite being convicted and ultimately executed, we have enormous sympathy for Socrates, and his valiant effort is largely admired. On the surface, it seems he's responsible for his own failure. His behavior in the years leading up to the trial was outlandish and attention-seeking. He made friends with Athens' Spartan conquerors and even tutored them in how to be more effective rulers. And he made himself enemies with the city leaders. He mistreated his family. He tacitly encouraged young people, through example, to shake the unstable foundation of their society. And at the end of his defense, he quite simply failed to persuade enough jurors of his innocence. But again, we see that the intervention of the gods of sorts lends honor and nobility to the defeated. One of the charges against Socrates was impiety. He was accused of introducing a new god to Athens. He claimed to have the voice of something divine within him, which he called his daimonion. Today, we might call it his conscience, but Socrates describes it as, "This thing I have had ever since I was a child. It is a voice which comes to me and always forbids me to do something which I am going to do, but never commands me to do anything." After being convicted of the capital charges, Socrates is allowed to address the jury before they vote on a sentence. He informs them that his daimonion isn't urging him to withhold his speech, so speak he does. What follows is a damning indictment of Athenian society and culture from a man who repeatedly says he doesn't fear death, but only fears acting contrary to virtue. Afterwards, the jury that narrowly convicted Socrates overwhelmingly votes to execute him. They weren't about to let all that virtue talk get too loud without punishment. While Socrates' failure was not prophesied the way Oedipus or Leonidas's were, he could not have acted in accord with his spiritual entity and still avoided conviction. His choices were between betraying truth and living and speaking in accord with his daimonion and dying. In other words, the choice was vice in life or virtue in death, between what was right and what was expedient. The gods proposed this choice for Socrates, and he chose to do what most closely imitated the path of the divine. But while he was executed for it, as with Thucydides, the Athenians sought to punish their gods by proxy, the world honors him still over 25 centuries later. That's the end of part 1. Hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it. When you get a chance, check out part 2. Me and Theodore would really appreciate it. Till then, be well.